Hi quilters, welcome to the 11th video in our series of projects using 5-inch squares or charm packs. Today we are making a charm tote in two fabric combinations, light and bright and dark and elegant. For this charm tote, you will need one charm pack and half a yard for lining. To make straps, you will need 1/4 yard of fabric or 2 1/8 yards of webbing. I'm choosing webbing to make it easier, faster, and for its durability. From your charm pack, you will need to find 32 5-inch squares. When sorting through the charm pack, I took out all of the duplicate charms so I would have only one of each fabric. If desired, you could leave out certain colors or certain designs. Just pick and choose the charms you like. If you want a lighter bag or a darker bag, buy 2 matching charm packs and pick out the pieces from both charm packs that you want to use. If you don't want to use a charm pack, you can use fabrics from your stash, or you can cut rectangles from 2.5-inch strips. You can cut the charm squares one at a time, or you could stack them to cut multiples at once. Once you've found your 32 5-inch squares, cut each in half to get 64 2.5-inch by 5-inch rectangles. If you follow the written pattern, it says to cut 34 squares into 68 rectangles, but you actually only need 32 squares cut into 64 rectangles. We will leave a link in the description below that will take you straight to the pattern from the Moda website. I have one set of rectangles cut, now it's time to do the other set. Once we're done cutting, it'll be time to head to the sewing machine. Make sure, unless directed otherwise, to use 1/4-inch seam allowances. First, start by sewing sets of 2 rectangles together. You're going to sew the 2.5-inch ends together. Use all of the rectangles to make the sets of 2. While sewing these rectangles together, I just made sure that I wasn't sewing the same fabrics together, and I tried to use different colors and designs while making the pairs of rectangles. You will end up with 32 sets of 2 rectangles. Next, we're going to sew the sets of 2 into sets of 4. We'll make 16 sets of 4 rectangles. As I'm sewing these, I'm just trying to make sure I'm not sewing the same 2 fabrics into a set of 4. Just mix up the patterns and designs really well. And finally, we're going to sew these sets of 4 into sets of 8. I didn't worry too much here if a fabric was the same in both sets of 4 because those will end up on opposite sides of the bag. This is where I realized that the written pattern was wrong. I had an extra set of 4 rectangles. Since they were already cut, I decided I could make use of these extra rectangles by making a pocket for the bag. I decided to take it apart and sew it back together using the 5-inch sides of the rectangles to make a large rectangle, and then I'll use 2 of the leftover charms from the charm pack to make the other side of the pocket. Now you're going to take 4 of those sets of 8 and sew them into a loop just by sewing the 2 ends together. At this point, you should have 4 sections that are 8 rectangles long and 4 sections that are sewn into a loop. Now it's time to press. Press all the seams in one direction, or if you prefer, you can press the seams open. Pressing the seams in one direction does take less time. For the construction of this bag, there are no seams to match up, so it doesn't matter which way you press it. For the pocket, in addition to the 4 rectangles that are sewn together, you need 2 charms left over from the charm pack sewn together. Press all the seams to one side or open if you prefer. Round 1 is done, so now I'm going to work on the other colorway. If you're enjoying our series of videos using charm packs or 5-inch squares, make sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe. If you're looking for a place to purchase charm packs, check out our website, thequiltedforest.com. We have all our charm packs listed there. Also, make sure you check your local quilt shop. They might have charm packs too. The nice thing about using a charm pack for this tote is that you get a wide variety of patterns, colors, and designs in the charm pack. But if you wanted a more cohesive look to your bag, you could just pick a few fabrics from your stash and cut your own rectangles. If you're one of those people that has a bucket of 2.5-inch strips, you can raid that strip bucket to cut rectangles for these totes. If you don't have a half yard of fabric for the lining, you could also sew 2 fat quarters together to get a 18 by 40-inch piece to start with that you could cut down to the 16 by 36-inch piece that you need. To make the pocket, put the 2 sides of the pocket right sides together and sew all the way around, leaving an opening that's about 2.5 inches on one end of the unit. When I'm sewing these 2 pieces together, I like to sew from the edge of the fabric to the starting point and then from the end point to the edge of the fabric as well, backstitching in both spots. Once you've sewn around all 4 sides, trim the seam to 1/4 inch and clip the corners to reduce bulk. Because I've sewn to the edge of the fabric, when I turn this piece right side out, the seam will turn inward to make it easier to close up the seam later. Turn it right side out and poke the corners out to get a nice sharp corner. There's no need to sew the opening shut. We will top stitch the pocket to the lining later, and that will also sew the opening shut. Just press the pocket and set it aside. Now it's time to sew the long rows together. Have your 4 long pieces and your 4 loops. You'll take each of the loops and cut in the center of one of the 2.5 by 5-inch rectangles. These will be slightly shorter than the other 4 rows because of the seam allowances. You now have 4 rows of 8 that are 36.5 inches long and 4 rows of 7 with a square on each end that are 36 inches long. Sew a row of 7 rectangles to a row of 8 rectangles. You're going to make 4 of these units. I did pin these to help keep the fabric in place as I sewed, and I centered the 7 rectangle unit on to the 8 rectangle unit. There will be a 1/4 inch on each end. Sew 4 sets of 2 long rows. Before we sew the sets of 2 into sets of 4, you want to press the seams in one direction. Now sew 2 sets of 4 long rows, alternating between the 8 rectangle rows and the 7 rectangle rows. Make sure to pin to keep the fabric in place as you sew. Press the sections of 4 and then sew those 2 sections together to get one unit that has 8 rows across. Once the bag top is put together, I'm going to add an extra step of quilting this unit with batting to make it a little bit sturdier. Once it's sewn, you want to press it really well and then layer it with some batting. You can use any kind of batting that you like, a fusible or a non-fusible, doesn't matter. I am using leftover warm and natural fabric that I've had left over from quilts. You just need the batting to be a little bit bigger than the front of the bag. At this point, the unit should measure 16.5 inches by 36.5 inches long. If you're using a fusible batting, fuse it to the wrong side of the bag top. If you're using a regular batting, you'll either need to pin baste or spray baste the bag top to the batting. My preferred method for spray basting is to use 505 spray, and then I also press it one last time just to make sure everything lays nice and flat. I spray half of the project, smooth it into place and press it, and then I spray the other half and do the same thing on the other side. And remember, this is just 2 layers. There's no lining yet. It's just the piece section and the batting. Once these 2 layers are attached to each other, it's time to do some quilting. I just put the walking foot on and did some simple quilting in the ditch with a matching thread. Normally when I'm quilting, I would start from the middle out, but for this project, I'm starting on the same end each time. I start from the same edge each time so that if the fabric does shift a little bit while it's being quilted, it will all shift in the same direction. I'm also going to sew down each side of the project so that the edge is also sewn to the batting. You could add more stitching lines if you want it to be more heavily quilted, or you could do some decorative stitches if you want to add a little fanciness to your bag, but simple in the ditch quilting is all it really needs. I have all the quilting in the ditch done, and if you want to, you could also add some lines going the other direction for a little bit more quilting, or you could do some decorative quilting, make arrows or something, but I'm just going to keep it simple and use the quilting in the ditch. Trim all 4 sides of the quilted section. It should measure 16.5 inches across and 36 inches end to end. Now you need to cut the lining to the same size as the top of the bag. I actually usually cut mine slightly smaller, like 1/8 to 1/4 inch smaller, so that it sits a little flatter on the inside of the bag and doesn't get all bunchy at the bottom. Now the pattern does give excellent directions for cutting out the corners to box the corners of the bag. So I'm doing their method on one of the bags, although I should have waited until I had sewn the sides before I cut out the squares, but it does all work out. I will show you my favorite method on the other bag that I'm making. So the only difference here is that I cut my corners out before I sewed the side seams. Before I put the side seams in on the lining piece, I am going to add the pocket while it's still flat. I found the center of the bag, and then I just sort of eyeballed it, putting the pocket in place where I thought it should go. I wanted it closer to the top of the bag, but not so close that it would get stuck in the seams. So give yourself a few inches at the top. All you need to do is top stitch the pocket in place onto the lining. The top stitching will also close the opening that you had in the pocket, so there was no need to hand sew. It's just all done at once. First, I'm going to sew the sides of the lining piece. I will do one side completely, and on the other side, I will leave an opening of about 4 to 5 inches for turning the bag right side out at the end. Before I do the side seams for the outside of the bag, I want to make sure to add the handles. The bag pattern does give directions for making fabric handles. I like to use the webbing for handles instead because it doesn't show wear quite as fast. I centered the strap on a seam line, the second seam from each side, for an easy way to identify where the strap would go. I left about 1.5 inches past the side of the bag to make the straps a little sturdier and less likely to pull out of the seam if I put too much weight in the bag. I also sew based it in place instead of pinning to make it easier on me later when I'm sewing the bag together. I will sew back and forth over it a few times to make sure it stays in place. Also make sure that you don't twist the strap as you're putting it on the bag. Make sure it lays flat. Once you have the straps in place, sew the side seams of the bag front. I will usually sew extra seams beyond the first seam for durability. If for some reason the original seam becomes unstitched or strained, the second seam will hold it together. Next, you'll fold the bottom corner cut openings out so that you have a flat edge to sew, and then that will box out your corners to make the bag. Pin the corners in place and then sew a 1/4 inch seam and then stitch a reinforcing seam beyond the first seam. I will backstitch at the beginning and the end of the seam just to make sure everything stays in place. You'll repeat the process with the lining fabric. Turn the front of the bag right side out and insert into the lining, match the side seams and pin into place. Make sure that the straps are in between the lining and the quilted section. Next, you'll sew a 1/2 inch seam all around the top edge. I like to remove my tray and then have a smaller part so that my bag can kind of fit underneath the machine a little bit. Makes it a little bit easier to sew. After I've sewn the first seam, I will always sew a second seam about a 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch away from the first seam. I just like to have a little reassurance that the seam is going to stay together. Using the opening that you left in the lining, turn the whole thing right side out. Once it's all right side out, close the opening of the lining. There is no need to hand sew, just take the seam and stitch it on your sewing machine. The sewn seam will be on the inside of the bag, so no one will even see it. Use thread matching the lining to camouflage it even more. Put the lining on the inside of the quilting section and kind of wiggle it around in there to get it nice and flat. Once you have it situated, press the top of the bag and then top stitch all around the top edge of the bag. I top stitched very close to the edge and then also about 1/4 inch away from that line. This is another place where you could use some decorative stitches if you wanted to play around with your machine a little bit. On the inside, that 1.5 inches of the strapping that's inside that seam, you'll be able to feel it. You'll want to sew in the ditch on top of that part to reinforce the straps. Charm tote 1 is done. Now I'm going to show you a different method to box out the corners on the second charm tote. For this method, you don't have to cut squares out of the corners of the lining and bag front. Make sure to add your straps and pockets and then sew the side seams first, making sure to leave an opening in the lining. Box out the bottom of the bag and you should end up with these triangle points. You can sew either on the seam or you can sew on the other side from side to side. But I usually just sew right on the seam because it's going to make it nice and square. Make sure to reinforce the seams on both sides. Measure the distance from the seam line to the point on the side, and then you will use that same distance for making the seam in the lining. Once you've sewn the seam, make sure to cut out the extra triangle of fabric to reduce bulk. Again, you'll need to close the seam in the lining and then top stitch all around the top of the bag. The straps on this bag are a little bit wider than the straps on the other bag. So instead of centering them on a seam, I centered them on the rectangles. For this version, instead of sewing a line to reinforce the handles on the inside where you can feel the excess handle hanging down on the inside of the bag, I sewed a little box with an X running through it. I know that I generally put a lot of weight in my bags. I like to carry books around and things, so I wanted to add some extra hold on these straps to make sure they weren't going to go anywhere. For a quick update on my charm pack usage, before I started this video, I had 61 charm packs. So for this video, I used 2 charm packs. So now I'm down to 59 charm packs. Once the bags were done, I only had about 8 charms left from each of the charm packs. So I stuck those charms in my charm bucket of leftover charms from all the projects, which is about half full from where it started out. I am very pleased with the way both of these bags turned out. Quilting the piece section and adding the pocket really takes this tote bag to the next level. The pocket is the perfect size to hold either a checkbook or a phone or both. I hope you'll break out your charm pack stash and make yourself or a friend a bag soon. If you enjoyed this video, we hope you give us a thumbs up, leave us a message in the comments section, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!